As you said, all the major public sector unions urging people to down tools. The crowds here in Paris are just starting to arrive in Place de la Nation. Behind me, we've had people walking out in the health and education sectors, the transport sector, local government employees. Obviously, all of this, as you said, does cause disruption. Air France, for example, saying that 1/3 of their flights would be affected by all of this. Schools and hospitals have been affected. The public transport network here in Paris, and we understand elsewhere in France, emerging relatively unscathed. Now, unions have been promising that this would be the biggest strike of its kind in about a decade. There's certainly quite a few people out here in Paris. Figures hard to come by, however. It kind of depends who you believe. The authorities saying 55,000 people walking out and out on the streets, and organisers claiming up to 400,000.
Chris, is this the same as those protests that were held against the President's labour law reform?
Well, it is and it isn't. What we're seeing today is uniquely people who work for the French state. This has been something that's been brewing actually for a few years now. Their argument really is that as their working conditions either get worse or stagnate, people in the private sector have been getting a better deal. They're angry, for example, about having to make extra welfare payments at a time when their salaries, their purchasing power isn't catching up. Angry too, as you said, about Macron's plans to get rid of 120,000 state sector jobs by the end of his 5-year mandate. Now, in terms of those unions, however, it is a bit more of a complicated picture. Macron's labour code reform applies across the economy, including in the private sector. One of the unions that's out today, the CGT, traditionally one of the more militant ones, has been leading parallel protests against that. But other unions have been involved in negotiations with the Macron government, and reluctantly in some cases are now largely on board. Obviously, the French government will be watching all of this very carefully. French history is littered with examples of administrations, politicians being forced to back down on economic reforms in the face of pressure from the streets. And as such, the French government, again, despite some of Mr. Macron's more aggressive language of late, which hasn't impressed many people here, is treading relatively carefully and promising more negotiations with unions in the coming weeks.